Okay, so this movie is just a narration of the PowerPoint that's available on Moodle. And this should help us finish chapter 2, or excuse me, chapter 6. And we're just going to discuss more aerobic and anaerobic ways that cells get energy and talk about some evidence that suggests the first cells were anaerobic and evidence that suggests how old aerobic metabolism is. And so I've got two pictures here. These are some really important evidence. These are banded iron formations, and they've been known for a long time because they're really good sources of iron. And so some of these occur in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and Minnesota. You have others in uh, Australia. It's a widespread formation about the same time, and there's layers of iron oxides there, and I'll talk more about it later. Okay, so last time we introduced the idea of energy and nutrients and ecosystems, and we talked about organisms that were able to use sunlight. And using sunlight, they could take carbon dioxide and water, and uh, they could change that so that they could produce glucose. So they'd take that energy from sunlight, turn it into ATP, and use the ATP to make glucose from carbon dioxide and water. As a waste product, that reaction produces oxygen, and that's photosynthesis. And all plants do this, and some bacteria do this, the cyanobacteria. Okay, and then the other part of this cycle of energy and cycle in life is aerobic respiration. And here they show mitochondria, and that takes glucose and oxygen and takes the energy, decomposes glucose in the presence of oxygen in the mitochondria to get that energy that was stored to make ATP. And as a waste product, this produces carbon dioxide and water. And so this is this cycle of carbon and hydrogen and water and oxygen, and this cycle of energy that's driven by the sun. Okay, autotrophs can use carbon dioxide and an energy source to make glucose. Heterotrophs get their energy from some sort of organic carbon compound, like glucose. Okay, so all cells need energy and all cells produce ATP. And the best way to make ATP is to use aerobic respiration, where you take glucose, or you could do it with a fat or another sugar, and you decompose glucose. And you do this through a couple steps. One is glycolysis. It's a metabolic pathway that occurs in the cytoplasm. And this produces pyruvate, which you then oxidize, and that oxidized product enters the Krebs cycle. And the Krebs cycle tears apart that pyruvate to produce carbon dioxide and energy carriers, NADH and FADH2, and those go into electron transport, and there the majority of ATP is produced. Wherever oxygen is available, this is the pathway that's going to be used because it's the most efficient pathway. You can get 36 ATP out of one glucose molecule. And so this is a very efficient way to get a lot of energy out of an organic molecule. Okay, the majority of this pathway is going to happen in the mitochondria. Only the first part, glycolysis, happens in the cytoplasm. Everything else happens in the mitochondria. The Krebs cycle and pyruvate oxidation happen in the matrix. And then at the inner mitochondrial membrane is the electron transport chain. And that is where the majority of ATP is made. Okay, so we do this, all animals do this, plants do this, they have mitochondria, and at night this is what they do, or if the sun's not shining bright enough. And some bacteria can do this. We can also, if oxygen's not available, we can get by doing just the first part of this. Okay, in humans, we call this anaerobic metabolism, and that's just glycolysis. Okay, the splitting of glucose into two pyruvates, and then taking the energy carriers that are produced and sticking them back on the pyruvates to produce lactic acid. Okay, not all our cells can do this, but muscle cells can do this. And this is a relatively short reaction, only 10 steps, doesn't require oxygen. And we can do this quite quickly and often right next to the parts of the cell that need glucose. So this is a very rapid way to produce ATP, but it also, because it's very inefficient, it only produces 2 ATP per glucose molecules. This rapidly consumes glucose and it rapidly produces lactate or lactic acid. Okay, the buildup of lactic acid is a problem for muscles because it changes the pH of the muscle cell and it's hard to get rid of. It has to be moved out of the muscle cell and transported to the liver. And the liver can metabolize that. So this source of energy, although very, very rapid, uses lots of glucose. It's inefficient, and it produces an end product that has to be gotten rid of, and it's going to take some time to get rid of. So we can only do this about 30 seconds in our muscle cells. But for some activities, this is really important. First, in people, this anaerobic training, to train this system, is often referred to as strength training. And it's high intensity, short duration, and it uses carbohydrates only. So it's a kind of building up your carbohydrate system. But for sprinters, power lifters, for many types of athletic events, this is the best type of training. With training, this will produce stronger muscles. It will reinforce this anaerobic system, and it'll increase bone mass. And so sprinters are doing this, power lifters are doing this. On the other hand, we can train for the other system, aerobic training. Aerobic training involves lower intensity training, but long duration. So usually at a minimum 15 minutes, and this is going to be a long duration, but less intense, so that people can keep up this activity for a longer time. Aerobic training can use both fats and carbohydrates, so it helps people lose weight. It's a very effective way to lose weight. And because this requires the delivery of oxygen to the muscle, it's going to improve the heart, the blood vessels, all of the circulatory system. It'll improve the respiratory system, and so it has dramatic health benefits. Okay, and so this is what happens in people, but in other organisms, energy without oxygen can be kind of different. Although all animals use glycolysis and produce lactic acid, in other organisms it's different. In yeast and in plants, very often, when oxygen isn't available, they'll use glycolysis, but instead of producing lactic acid, they will produce ethanol and carbon dioxide. In yeast, this is really economically important because we use this to produce alcoholic beverages like wine and beer. We also use yeast to make bread rise, and so very, very economically important. And in bacteria, its glycolysis is also used if oxygen isn't available, and they have other enzymes that are going to let them produce other alcohols, methanol, propanol. They can produce acids like acetic acid, other acids. They can also sometimes even produce methane from anaerobic type reactions. And so there's lots of uses of anaerobic reactions. Often you'll see these big tanks, and they'll be having either yeast or bacteria inside them that are working with them. So this is a really economically important thing, and there's lots of jobs for biologists and microbiologists and chemists working with fermentation type reactions, not just yeast, but also bacteria. And as we talk about living organisms and energy, it's important to recognize all cells do glycolysis. It's the one energy-yielding metabolic pathway that all cells can do. It's similar in all cells. It occurs in the cytoplasm, involves the same number of enzymes, and we think, therefore, it was the first used energy-yielding reaction in cells. It's not the only anaerobic reaction, but it is the one that all cells can do, no matter where they come from, no matter whether they can do aerobic respiration or not. In fact, we know aerobic respiration is new. Okay, and this is kind of the interesting thing. We know from this that that only a small subset of cells, eukaryotes and some bacteria, can do aerobic respiration. And we know from looking at minerals and fossils going far enough back that the early atmosphere of the Earth, the early waters were anaerobic, that it was a reducing atmosphere, which means there was no oxygen. There was lots of things like methane and ammonia, lots of carbon dioxide, but no oxygen. And so we can tell that, and we find microfossils in those environments. And how do we know this? Well, that gets us back to this banded iron formations. These banded iron formations, these were deposited in aquatic environments at the time that oxygen concentrations reached high enough levels to start precipitating iron oxides. Okay, iron is very soluble in anaerobic waters. If no oxygen is available, iron concentrations can get quite high. But once waters have high levels of iron in them, the soluble iron becomes oxidized and then it precipitates. And so the banded iron formations occur when iron concentrations reached or oxygen concentrations reached high enough levels to cause iron to precipitate. And so we can see these things, and there's huge deposits of these. And so we get an age at which the Earth began producing oxygen. And it's about 2 billion years ago, somewhere 2 to 2.5 billion years ago, where we see these banded iron formations. After that time, when oxygen was high in the atmosphere and high in the environment, these are very rare types of sedimentary rocks. And so we know that all eukaryotes use oxygen. There are no eukaryote fossils before the banded iron formations, and the only types of fossils are anaerobic organisms. The first aerobic organisms to be preserved in fossils are kind of what we would expect. They are cyanobacteria, a type of bacteria that can do photosynthesis that releases oxygen. And these are among the oldest banded iron formation fossils, and we call these stromatolites. And they approximately go back to about 2.7 billion years ago. And so this kind of gives us the whole picture of life on Earth and where these metabolic pathways came from and how old they are. So kind of cool information, and really some cool evidence on it. Okay, so next time we're going to start talking about photosynthesis and the mechanisms of photosynthesis and the metabolic pathways.